There are two contrapuntal themes running through the latter half of the 18th century. One is the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and the other is the spiritual revivification in opposition to the Enlightenment. One is industrial, technical. The other is religious and spiritual. If you look on the screen, you'll see some of the unusual events that have occurred, first-time events, that we find all too familiar today. The first iron rolling mill was founded in 1754. The first female doctor was named in University of Hull in Germany. The first canal was dug in England. It's as the Sankey Brook Canal. It ran to the coal fields and brought the coal fields to industrial England, to Birmingham, and sites where steel mills were developing. In 1762, you had the first blast furnace. In 1764, you had Hargreaves' spinning jenny, a machine that could weave 8 threads at once. And so you had the mills of England's towns beginning to flourish. You had a more efficient steam engine to prepare for redundancy. You had the first medical school in America at the University of Pennsylvania in 1765. You had James Watt developing the separate condenser steam engine. Arkwright's spinning machine, which meant large enough looms and large enough machinery to start the factory development. You have Cugnot's steam carriage. This is the first automobile. By steam, you were able to move 4 people 2.25 miles per hour. Now that's about the speed you get on the Katy Freeway today during rush hour. So this could have operated in Houston in the 20th century. You have John Hunter writing a book called The Natural History of Human Teeth. And you have the development of the foundations of dental anatomy and pathology. Go to our medical library in the medical center, in the rare book room, and you'll see shelves of books written in the 18th century and illustrated in the 18th century dealing with face physiognomy and cranial physiognomy. You had a submarine developed in 1775, a one-man submarine propelled by a propeller. In 1775, science discovered that young boys, as chimney sweeps, were getting cancerous growths in their elbows and in their knees because they were subject to carcinogens as they went up and down chimneys. That was in 1775. We're going to see William Blake, a major English poet, who discusses chimney sweeps. In 1779, the first iron bridge over the River Severn, 196 feet in span. That's a magnificent achievement. You no longer needed tugboats to cross waterways. In 1779, you had the first version of the bicycle in Paris. In 1780, the invention of the fountain pen. People are responding to what industrialization can produce. In 1783, James Watt expanded and developed the first rotary steam engine. 1784, Benjamin Franklin developed bifocal eyeglasses. And in 1785, we had the first metal rails with flanged wheel rotary motion steam engine. This is the same steam engine that's riding our rails today on the Burlington and various other railroads. In 1783, the first hydrogen balloon. We've discussed ballooning when we discussed Rasselas. That was only 1783. Rasselas was written in 1759, when the concept was already clear, but no one had yet flown. And now they are flying, and of course, by Napoleon's day, he's using balloons on the battlefield. The first steamship on the Seine in France was 1783, and the first steamboat in America on the Delaware River in 1787. We've been witness to a terrible tragedy when the astronauts were killed in space when their ship blew apart. But one wonders how many people died as the steam engine was being developed. People didn't know how much steam to fuel. They didn't know how powerful the rivets had to be or how close together they had to be knit until they experimented. It's estimated that there are 1,000 steamships at the bottom of the Mississippi River that blew up during the early period of steamboat travel. And the 5 astronauts, while their death is tragic, they were involved in experimental work, and so were these people on these steamships. In 1787, the first iron barge for carrying armaments. And in 1789, the first cotton factory driven by steam in Manchester, England. And this is why you had the slave ships coming out of Manchester, because you get the cotton coming from plantations and England being able to card them there. And of course, the changes in civilization become monumental. In 1798, the first machine for the continuous production of paper on rolls. You no longer were putting pulp in metal frames, crushing them, drying them, and having sheets of paper. Now you had them flowing on wheels, on drums. And that's the way paper is manufactured today. In 1800, chlorine was introduced in England to purify water. And in the first lathe was developed to develop screws at any pitch or any diameter. It's only been in recent years that man-made lathes no longer operate, that we have computer-driven lathes, particularly in places like NASA. Now, that's the industrial aspect of the latter half of the 18th century. What is the spiritual aspect? The spiritual aspect is a development that occurred as a result of the reaction against the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And what you had were religious groups from east to west, reverting back to the spirit, reverting back to the heart, reverting away from the traditional churches and religious sects in various parts of the world. In Russia, you had the fanatic Strelsky that Peter the Great tried to put down. In France, in Eastern Europe, you had the Hasidic Jews who dressed in large black hats and black suits and sought to repair themselves from the more intellectual or more studious scholars who are dependent upon Enlightenment philosophy, reacted against people like Spinoza. In France, you had the Huguenots, who were spiritually and somewhat fanatically opposed to traditional church patterns. In England, you had the Methodist Church. The Anglicans, to a large extent, had abandoned the prisons. The Anglicans, to a large extent, had abandoned the poor. And Wesley came in with a Methodist movement that went into the prisons, that went into the brothels, that began to isolate each person as an individual whose spirit could feel God without the intervention of the clergy. And you see the movement go to America, where you have the New Light Church, represented by Jonathan Edwards, who again was representing the anti-intellectual Enlightenment movement. These essentially were the types of reactions that you had, so that the 18th century is not embodied as a single industrially developed unit, nor is it a unit owned by the Anglican Church. It is a multivariate, dynamic period of time that saw, out of these religious movements and out of the technological movements, the growth of a great nation, the United States. Now, I want to look now at the spiritual side, because what we're going to do is look at William Blake. Now, those dates I gave you are relatively, you can try to compare some of them, although I don't have them side by side here, and perhaps I should have. Blake was born in 1757, and when he was 4 years old, he claims to have seen a tree full of angels in a field at Peckham Rye. Blake is a spiritualist at the age of 4. Why do people see religious objects at the age of 4? Why do they see religious ideas? Blake and his family were part of some of these unusual religious movements, these spiritual movements. At one point, Blake was associated with the Muggletonians, who were, in some ways, deeply spiritual and in some ways isolated from others. Now, in 1767, his brother was born when he was 10 years old. His brother died early, and Blake claimed to see him in dreams and in spiritual visions. This man who essentially became an engraver. In 1772, when he was 15 years old, Blake was apprenticed to James Bazier, an engraver to the London Society of Antiquaries. Now, all illustrations in the 18th century had to be engraved. We can't show you any illustrations today because the copyright is quite firm and the expense is quite high. But what you want to do is go to the art library and look at some of the engravings of Blake. He began his study in the Royal Academy, and he was a commercial engraver for a bookseller by the name of Joseph Johnson, and he met the sculptor Max Flaxman, for whom he also developed designs. This was an intensely religious period. In 1780, you had the Gordon riots. The Roman Catholics sought citizenship, and Parliament was ready to grant them, but England rioted, and 1,000 people were killed in the streets of England in order to protest Roman Catholic citizenship. In 1782, Blake married Catherine Boucher, who was an illiterate woman. He taught her to help him. He taught her to paint, and she became part of his life's work. Now, we're going to go on a little bit more because I'm going to give you some examples of what Blake believes. He became associated with Emanuel Swedenborg. Now, Emanuel Swedenborg was a major scientist of the 18th century. But when he was 52 years old, or 57 years old, he became spiritually motivated to leave science and to seek God in his own movement. The Swedenborgians gathered about him as though he were a spiritual icon, a spiritual leader, and he began to interpret religions. He wrote Wisdom of Angels concerning divine love and divine wisdom. He believed in predestination, but he believed that each person is motivated by the human spirit, and he isolated himself from any church sect or from any religious sect and developed a following. There are still Swedenborg churches in this world, and there's a Swedenborg bookstore in Boston, Massachusetts, which follows this unusual religious sect. Blake and his wife belonged to Swedenborg's group in 1788, and in fact we have their signatures on a book, a church book, in 1789. But Blake became disillusioned with Swedenborg when, instead of having a movement, he formed a church. And forming a church meant then he was focusing on institutional religion and putting people in a box. He also claimed that Swedenborg seemed to be favoring the angels. Now, why should Blake be upset that Swedenborg is following the angels? Well, that becomes a very, very interesting concept. Blake believed that religion had been stultified by the church, that the priests had codified religion so that it became a religion of oppression. He felt that the spirit that motivated people was being suppressed by the church, and therefore the angels and heaven were to him sterile worlds. Where did he go for an active world? Where did he go for a generated world? Blake was more interested in the devils than in hell. But from a positive standpoint, not from a negative standpoint. And you may ask yourself, how did Blake proceed from a positive standpoint, from a negative standpoint to a positive standpoint? Well, we're going to look at that in just a few minutes. In 1789, he wrote Songs of Innocence. Now, we're going to look at some of the Songs of Innocence, and you would think that what he's talking about is something that's passive and something placid, and people are happy because they're innocent. The truth of the matter is that Blake found that all innocents are being deprived by the church and being subverted by religious morals that prohibit and inhibit religious truth. And consequently, the Songs of Innocence is not a book of passive odes. It's a book of satire, where he's pointing out the faults of society, and we're going to look at a few of those poems when we get there. In 1793, he wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which is a parody of Swedenborg's writings, because Blake, not only did he object to the fact that Swedenborg formed his own church, but he objected to the fact that Swedenborg had, in fact, believed in predestination. And Blake said we didn't know how that happened. And that has to be left up to only one figure, and that was Christ. And Blake was, regardless of the religion, regardless of the fabric of society, regardless of sectarian animosity, regardless his animadversion to organized religion, he was perhaps the paramount Christian because he believed in his Savior. And nothing else could interfere with that. He even saw his Savior in visions in his garden. This is a time of the American Revolution. And he defended the American Revolution in America, a Prophecy, which he followed with another book called Songs of Experience. Now, where Songs of Innocence deals with satire, Songs of Experience is fully ironic. And so, in neither of these works are we looking at innocence, and we'll see how these work in just a few moments. What does an engraver do for a living? He produced 537 watercolor drawings In 1796, he began 537 watercolor drawings completed during his lifetime, and 43 were for Edward Young's Night Thoughts. In 1800 and 1803, he studied Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And in 1803, he almost went to jail. He and his wife were sitting in his garden. They did it often. They saw visions of biblical figures. They saw at least Blake saw his brother. But in 1803, England was concerned about an invasion from France under Napoleon. And troops were stationed up and down the eastern coast of England. I mean, if we are today in this society concerned about terrorism and fearful of insurgents coming into our country, imagine the English knowing that French fleets had come down the channel, Dutch ships had destroyed the English fleet, and troops were waiting for a French invasion. Blake felt that the troops were being housed by the government unfairly, that they were a burden on society, and a soldier walked into his garden and Blake threw him out. The soldier by the name of Schofield brought charges against Blake of treason for comments that he says Blake made against the English and in favor of foreign troops. And it took a year before Blake was found innocent of the charges, but he could have been tried, he could have been executed. It didn't deter him from other works. He goes on in his lifetime as an engraver to produce monumental works, among them books like Milton and Jerusalem. He did a famous engraving of the Canterbury Pilgrims, where you see the Canterbury Pilgrims sitting on horses. And ultimately, he died in 1827, I believe. What does your book say? 1827, I had the wrong date there. He spanned the Romantics, and the Romantics like to consider him one of theirs. I like to consider him fully developed and articulated in the 18th century. Now, one of Blake's characteristics was that he was influenced by various figures. He was influenced by a Renaissance writer by the name of Paracelsus, Parcelsus. He was influenced by a German mystic by the name of Jacob Boehme, Boehme. And these were people who had been influenced by Hebraic Kabbalah. To the extent that Blake understands Kabbalah and follows Kabbalah, comes from the biblical phrase in the first creation, where the Hebrew scriptures say God created man, God created she and him together. The rib episode comes later. But the first mention of the creation of Adam and Eve suggests that they are one and that they are a synthesis. The fact they are a synthesis means that every man has female emanations and every woman has male emanations, male feature characteristics. And consequently, when Blake develops his own cosmology of figures, he doesn't want to separate male and female. He doesn't want to separate male intuition from female intuition. He doesn't want to separate sexuality from sin. He doesn't want to separate the body from the soul, to the extent that he is looking for a fusion of spiritual life rather than a separation of life. He is a Kabbalist. Now, let's look first at the Songs of Innocence, which was his first book. Blake wrote this book, and he actually engraved all these letters on plates. If you see them originally, you will see colorful plates that he and his wife colored. But he would engrave in these plates, and he would write backwards so that when he printed on paper, you would see the engraving in the right direction. At a later time, he developed a certain set of chemicals that he would put on paper. Then he would write on the paper substance, transfer it backwards to a plate, etch the plate, and then print off the plate. There are people who have spent a lifetime trying to study Blake's engraving and etching techniques. But the beginning of Songs of Innocence begins innocently. Here is the bard. Blake is the bard. Blake is the poet. Blake is the singer. He takes the guise of a piper because this, of course, is close to the spiritual psalms. This is the shepherd writing the psalms as David wrote the psalms. And anytime you liken yourself to David, you liken yourself to the Messiah. And so Blake, writing these words, felt that he was writing in the spirit, the messianic spirit, as a poet in guise of a shepherd. What we have here is almost a childish ballad, piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee. On a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me. The poetry is so mellifluous that one doesn't understand how much effort is put into it. Pipe a song about a lamb, so I piped with merry cheer. Piper, pipe that song again, so I piped. He wept to hear. Now, this may be the weeping of evangelism. It may be people who have reached a level of ecstasy where they cannot do anything but weep and wail, as the Methodists were prone to do as they were criticized by the Anglicans. He goes on, this poet, to explain what he's going to do in this poem. Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe. Sing thy songs of happy cheer. So I sung the same again while he wept with joy to hear. So this becomes the weeping of the enthusiast. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed. Now this, of course, is the inspiration of the poet. The inspiration of the poet, given God's capability to write and explain the world he is involved with. It's the gift that, if you're a gardener, Lenotre had, could not give to others. And so here is Blake describing his role as a poet. And I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs, every child may joy to hear. The only problem is that the songs are not happy. And consequently, while the poet would like to express his enthusiasm about the joy of the world doesn't offer the poet the opportunity to address a fictitious understanding. He's going to give you what is real. And so we look at a poem called The Little Black Boy. Blake was an abolitionist, among other, obviously. He was aware of the slave trade. He was aware of the dichotomy between the worlds. And during his lifetime, the slave trade was banned in England, 1807. So he was aware of it. Now, you have a painting that deals with this poem, that accompanies the poem. And when you look at the painting, you'll see that it is Christ at the end, sitting on a bench, and on either side of him are a black boy and a white boy, and their skin is transparent, translucent. It is literally silver. You can't tell the difference, because the soul is the same, whatever the skin may be. And that was Blake's poem. My mother bore me in the southern wild, the little black boy talking. And I am black, but oh, my soul is white. White as an angel is the English child. But I am black as if bereaved of light. Now, the rhyme scheme always becomes important. On the one hand, you have someone in the wild. On the other hand, you have the English child. On the one hand, the soul is white. On the other side is bereaved of light. Now, what is happening here is not Blake's demonstration of the differences between people's skin. What is shown is the way people perceive the differences of people's skin. My mother taught me underneath a tree, and sitting down before the heat of day, she took me on her lap and kissed me, and pointing to the east, began to say. So again, day gives us an opportunity to say something. Every day gives us the opportunity to enrich our lives. The tree is created to give us shelter, to give us comfort. They didn't know it in the 18th century, but also gives off oxygen, right? No carbon dioxide. The tree nevertheless becomes flourishing. The mother becomes is a flourishing and supportive individual. And what does she say? She's a woman of great faith. And remember, this is Blake. Look on the rising sun. He is sublime. He understands that which is great, that which is wonderful, and that which is awful. The sun can burn you. The sun is a wonder because it comes every day. And of course it's great because no one can approach it. No one can gain heat from, no one can control its heat. Look on the rising sun, there God does live, and gives his light and gives his heat away. Again, he believes in Genesis. This is the creation of the Spirit. This isn't something that stands by itself. And flowers and trees and beasts and men receive comfort in morning joy in the noonday. All right. Again, it's a spiritual life. And we are put on earth a little space that we may learn to bear the beams of love. The contrastive idea, of course, is that there are people in this world who have not learned to bear the beams of love. And while we're on this earth a little space, there are some who will never appreciate what they have here. And these black bodies and this sunburnt face is but a cloud and like a shady grove. The soul is what defines someone, not the skin and not the appearance. For when our souls have learned the heat to bear, and then we get care out of it, and the voice will allow us to rejoice. See, the rhymes are absolutely essential to the theme of this poem. For when our souls have learned the heat to bear, the cloud will vanish. We shall hear his voice saying, come out from the grove, my love, and care, and round my golden tent like lambs rejoice. And now we're back to the Psalms. The psalmist is now at work here. But Blake is looking beyond the skin. He's looking beyond slavery. He's looking for the spirit inside. And his religious spirit tells him that's where truth lay. Thus did my mother say and kiss me. And thus I say to little English boy, when I from black and he from white cloud free. And you can't become any more abolitionist than that. And round the tent of God like lambs we joy. I'll shade him from the heat till he can bear to lean in joy upon our Father's knee. He can't independently lean without being taught how to do and without having help. And then I'll stand and stroke his silver hair and be like him, and he will then love me. The poem is relatively subtle, but it isolates major political events of the day. It certainly understands the slave trade, but more important, it represents what is a free and untrammeled soul, ungoverned, unrestricted by religious sects, and uncontrolled by political events. And it becomes a relatively important poem in its cosmic perspective. Now, one thing Blake didn't like are people who control children. Beadles in the church control children. School teachers control children. And whenever you see a maid with fully clothed, she controls children. Holy Thursday is a satire on children being led to church who are being controlled by those who want to suppress their emotions. And here it goes. 'Twas on a holy Thursday, and you have this in your text. 'Twas on a holy Thursday, their innocent faces clean. The children walking two and two in red and blue and green. Now he's mocking. He's mocking this parade and these children walking in rules. Gray-headed beetles walked before with wands as white as snow till into the high dome of Paul's they like Thames waters flow. So they lead the children to St. Paul's Cathedral. If you've never seen St. Paul's Cathedral, just go to Austin, Texas and look at the state capitol. It's modeled after St. Paul's with the high dome and the high inside. He says, oh, what a multitude they seemed, these flowers of London town. Seated in companies they sit, with radiance all their own. They're all involved in this parade, this religious parade that he finds hypocritical, and I'll show you why in just a moment. Oh, what a multitude they seem, these flowers of London town. Seated in companies they sit with radiance all their own. The hum of multitudes was there. But multitudes of lambs, thousands of little boys and girls are raising their innocent hands. They're all praying the way they're directed to pray. They're all saying the service the way they're directed to say it. And there's no independent spirit there. Now, like a mighty wind, they raise to heaven the voice of song, or like harmonious thunderings, the heaven among. Beneath them sit the aged men, wise guardians of the poor. Then cherish pity, lest you drive an angel from your door. All this mechanism, all this control, all this church going, all this sitting, all this hand raising, is likely to drive an angel away. All right. Now we're going to go to the ultimate poem. Yes?
What is this about the guardians of the poor? Are these children from orphanages or something?
Pardon me?
Are these children from orphanages or something?
Yes.
Is that why we have the wise guardians of the poor?
Yes, most of them are controlled by the church. They're in orphanages. They are foundlings. They are people who have no families to look over them. The church has taken them over, and the church has turned them into puppets. That's Blake's version. Now, I had mentioned to you before that in the 18th century, a doctor discovered that chimney sweeps were suffering cancer. Now, how do you do that? These chimney sweeps were little boys, 8, 9 years old, and they would be lowered into chimneys to clean these chimneys. They would scale the chimneys with their elbows and their knees. And of course, the smoke from these chimneys is carcinogenic, and the youngsters would get cancers in their joints, and they would die horrible deaths. At some point, there was a law passed against using young children to do this work. That's nothing new. If you go down to the plastic chemical industry in Houston, benzene is used to produce most polyurethane products. There are 112 separate carcinogens in benzene. And people working in our plants have to be very, very careful that they don't contract any form of cancer as a result of working with these chemicals. And the industry tries to protect people against this problem. Now, the Chimney Sweeper, this becomes a very satirical poem. And we're going to see, this is in Songs of Innocence, mind you. Songs of Experience, we're going to see another version of the Chimney Sweeper in just a moment. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. So the youngster has been sold to someone who's his, and he's the apprentice to a chimney sweep, part of the industry. There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. Well, his hair had turned white because of the cancer. And the youngsters die early, and they die painfully. And so he was quiet, and that very night as Tom was a-sleeping, he had such a sight. Here's his vision. The thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. You can't become more cynical than that. This is where he sees his fellows in their coffins. Now comes the bitterness of the poem. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. So their misery, their cancers, their suffering, they're gone because now they're supposed to go to heaven. They are supposed to go to heaven. Edward Gibbon wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, and he has the chapter on religion, chapter 4, where he describes the rise of Christianity. It's a beautiful chapter, and he says, Christianity spread itself when people discovered that though they led miserable lives on this earth, they would conceivably have peace and harmony and a beautiful life in death. Blake is making fun of that episode. He's saying, this is the place where we have to have our pleasure, our joy, our independence, and our health. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. And down a green plain, leaping, laughing, they run, and wash in a river and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. Now, if you read that literally, that's what anyone ever hopes for who believes religiously. But Blake is saying quite the opposite. He's saying this is a mockery. If you're going to make these people suffer in this earth, and then you're going to promise them a glory afterwards, you're failing to understand the human spirit, the human needs, human wants, human desires, and what we owe human beings, a good life on this earth. Again, of course, to get the full breadth of the rhyme, you have to think Irish. So I'll repeat that last verse again with the Irish tint, the way people spoke in the 18th century. Then naked and white, all their blags left behind, they raised upon clothes and sparth in the wind. And the angel told Tom if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. He ends the poem with this irony. And so Tom awoke from this dream. We'd seen all these others in their coffins. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. And you can see how bitter that is, how unreal, how shamelessly people deal with these youngsters, and how bitterly Blake objects to the way that they have been assailed, beaten down, in effect murdered by this business. Now we're going to go to the next version of this set of poems. Here's the Chimney Sweeper again, but this is in the Songs of Experience. Blake again deals with a chimney sweeper. A little black thing among the snow, crying weep, weep in notes of woe. Where are thy father and mother, say? They're both gone up to the church to pray. Total irony. This is overt irony. This is cosmic irony, because they are praying, and they are praying while their children are dying. And it is reliable, the irony of a reliable narrator, because we know that this is Blake's words. Hear what he says and know that he means the opposite. Bitter, bitter irony. Because I was happy upon the heath and smiled among the winter snow, they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. This is your religious spirit. This is why you're going to church. To celebrate death and not life. And because I am happy and dance and sing, they think they've done me no injury, and are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. Now there he is. Injury and misery become the responsibility of the leadership of the country. Happy and dance and sing become a parallel, antithetical, and paradox to God and priest and king. God doesn't make us happy. The priests we dance before aren't listening to us. And the king we sing is causing us our death. So you've got an absolute parallelism of rhyme there. God and his priest and king rhyme with happy and dance and sing. And Blake doesn't let a word pass without its meaning. Its opposite meaning. Okay. Let's go to London. You don't have this in your book, but I want you to look at this poem. Remember, we're in industrialized London. We're in a world that's changing its appearance. We're into the Industrial Revolution. And Blake, who's looking for spiritual truth, finds in London the opposite of all that he values. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Now I'm going to show you in just a few moments what he means by mind-forged manacles when we look at the marriage of heaven and hell. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. And the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Remember, Blake is talking here about the Napoleonic Wars. He's talking about the wars between England and France. We're engaged in wars in our country. Do we have poets equal to Blake, trying to point out the poignancy of the battle, the consequences of the battle, the frustrations of the battle, and the victory of the battle? How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the new-born infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Now, he brings in the harlot not because he is damning her, but because this young girl whose husband has been killed in battle has no way of supporting her children, giving her children bread. And consequently, the marriage hearse bears the body of her dead husband, and her body can only be used to feed these children. The newborn infant's tear. I meant to bring it in. The New Yorker magazine in 2003 had a story about how Taliban women who once were forbidden to go out in public now have to go out in public as harlots in order to feed their children. It was in a New Yorker issue in the year 2003. And I could have brought it in to illustrate a poet who's dealing with this particular theme. Now, we're going to go back to Blake in a few moments, but first of all, let's look at one poem in which we get his full power. This poem, Songs of Experience, is a tribute to sublimity, to the power of creation and the power of the divinity to create any object regardless how we look at it. Most people look at tigers as ravenous creatures who are going to kill you. Here's the way Blake looks at it. The tiger is an animal of creation. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Fearful symmetry. Northrop Frye has written a book about Blake's poetry called Fearful Symmetry. But everything is symmetrical, mainly because water seeks its level. So you can only have 2 arms, 2 legs, 4 legs if you're an animal. You can't have 5. It just doesn't work that way. Trees are always symmetrical because water rises evenly. In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? That is, Blake, by the way, believes that the ultimate poet is Vulcan. And anytime you see a forge in existence, anytime you see a figure firing a furnace, he is a poet. Blake looks upon himself as firing the furnace because the poet stimulates activity, forges new ideas, creates a new substance. And so God, he says, is now like a forge, like a blacksmith. And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? Blake incidentally has a picture of a tiger in this particular poem that he drew from a book on medical physiology. What is it that creates genius? In what the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? Of course, he's talking about the creator, but he's talking about himself, the poet, whose ideas are burning in him. What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the Lamb make thee? And of course, creation represents diversity. Someone said there are 53,000 versions of spiders. I don't know how many different types of fish there are. Depends which restaurant you go into. Some serve red snapper no matter what fish they say they're serving. But some actually give you a variety. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of thy night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? So the tiger becomes representative of every creature in its diversity that this world represents. Now I want to go to another poem which you essentially don't have. You don't have it in your book, but it's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell.
Is everybody taking a copy from here? So here it goes.
May I have the roll sheet, please? Has the roll sheet gone about?
Everybody sign the roll sheet.
Thank you. I'd mentioned to you that Emanuel Swedenborg was Blake's first real spiritual leader. Swedenborg lived from 1688 to 1772. A renowned scientist who felt that the last judgment came in 1757 and the world was going to be resurrected with the second coming of Christ. In 1778, he wrote Heaven and Hell. In January 27, 1789, he founded a new church, and on April 13, 1789, Blake and his wife joined that church. But, as I've mentioned to you before, Blake disagrees with Swedenborg's theory of predestination. He felt that Swedenborg was too much on the side of the church, organized church. He had left the diversity. Swedenborg had published a book called Memorable Relations, and Blake parodied it with his memorable fancies. Now, when you look at The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake begins with the voice of the devil. This book was written between 1790 and 93. You don't have it on these sheets, but just look at it. He starts by saying, this is the voice of the devil. All Bibles or sacred codes have been the causes of the following errors. 1, that man has two real existing principles, a body and soul. Now, I've told you, remember Burns wrote in his poem, in his letter, where he was talking to Robert Ainsley, how do your husband and wife, how does your body and soul get together? Like man and wife, I suppose, always warring. Well, the church always has the body being lustful and lascivious and looking to satisfy its pleasures, and the soul holding it back. Blake said that's a false perception of you, the human being. He says your lust, your desire, your spirit are one with the soul, and what you do is exercise your desires and use them to your benefit, but don't suppress them, because then you suppress the human spirit. What else is an error according to the devil? That energy called evil is alone from the body, and that reason called God is alone from the soul. Which is not true. The reason can be evil, and the soul and the energy of the body can be good. Blake says, by separating, by bifurcating, by having the church damn one and praise the other, you're destroying what is the unity. And this is a Kabbalistic understanding, the unity of reason and understanding, and the body and soul. 3, he says it's an error to believe that God will torment man in eternity for following his energies. If you are lustful, if you are lively, if you are enthusiastic, if you are engaged in excess, this is part of your world. Learn to use it to your benefit and learn to appreciate the difference between the tiger and the lamb. But the following contraries are true, and this is Blake. Man has no body distinct from his soul. For that called body is a portion of soul discerned by the 5 senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. Now, when he says he objects to the fact that everyone depends on the 5 senses for their reason, he is anti-Lockean. I've told you that much of the age satirizes Locke. Tristram Shandy satirizes Locke. Swift satirizes Locke. Well, Blake is totally opposed to Locke. He says our real spirit comes from in our minds, from in our passions, from in our spirit, from the inside vision that Locke cannot determine and that cannot be studied by the senses. So he's totally opposite Locke here. When he says the 5 senses we claim are the inlets of the soul in this age, and he says wrong. He says all they do is let us know what creation is like, but they do not give us the soul. Second principle, energy is the only life and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. It's all one. Energy is eternal delight. And he starts this series by saying a memorable fancy where he is opposite Swedenborg. He says, as I was walking among the fires of hell, delighted with the enjoyment of genius. Now remember, in the 18th century, Blake says that heaven has been taken over by the clerics, by the priests, by the church, by those who want to suppress human passion, human emotion, human desire, and human creativity. Hell has taken over the role of heaven. And in his poem America, which we'll discuss next time, he has a figure Orc, the spirit of revolution, rising up from the chains of hell and representing the American Revolution and poetry. He says, I collected some of their proverbs, thinking that as the sayings used in a nation mark its character, so the proverbs of hell show the nature of infernal wisdom better than any description of buildings or garments. All right. Here are the proverbs of hell. Number 1. Let's see if we can figure out what this means. Misclose. In seed time learn, in harvest teach, in winter enjoy. How would you interpret that? Where's misclose? All right. In seed time learn, in harvest teach, in winter enjoy.
Could it be how things grow, maybe how ideas grow, and by the winter you have time to enjoy it?
Right. Yeah, I'd agree with that. Some people say you should save, you should nurture, you should harvest, and then you should preserve. Blake says, no, let's enjoy what you have. Let's spend our money. Let's go on vacation. let's not be misers in our old age. And let's not harbor religious strictures when we have a chance to celebrate what we know. Learn your religion in seed time. Celebrate it. Don't disguise it, hide it, or suppress it. Okay. Mr. Hayes, drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead. Press the button so we can hear you talking. You don't have a button? Someone will have to send his back to you. And drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead.
It means you can learn from the experience of people who lived before you.
You can what?
Learn from the experience of people who lived before you.
Yeah. Don't bury them. Don't mourn over them. Don't cry over them. Don't despair over them. Let them be part of your experience and drive full force over the past, right? Good. Good. All right. Miss Coletnito? Pardon me? Oh, Crockett. Yeah, I'm sorry. Miss Crockett Nieto. I'm sorry. Miss Crockett Nieto. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity.
If you're so worried about, putting up a show and remaining pious, I guess, then you won't be able to do anything because you're so incapable by the ideals that you hold for yourself.
All right. And some people complain that youngsters are too rash, youngsters are too much involved in music, youngsters are too much involved in sexual activity. The reason is because they can't engage in this anymore. They can't enjoy it anymore. Therefore, they complain about what younger people are doing. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity. Yes, Miss Crockett Nieto. All right. Mr. Dickerson. Let's look at the cutworm, dip him in the river who loves water. Dip him in the river who loves water. How would you interpret that?
Well, if you have a passion, you should follow through on it and seek that out. And if it takes immersing yourself in whatever it is, then that's probably the best way to seek about your desires.
And if someone throws a rock at you, try to divert him and let him throw footballs instead. Let him use his energy to do what he likes best. Don't suppress it, and don't keep him from doing it. Move on. All right. Let's look at some of these other. Miss Moon. Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion.
It's maybe talking about the hypocrisy, how that some of the people that are so adamant about religion are some of the ones that frequent the brothels.
All right. And because the brothel suppress sexual desire, because religion because religion suppresses sexual desire and tells people to behave in certain ways and has all the nots in the Bible, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, then people can't behave with some lust and joy and energy at home. They have to go out, right? So brothels are built with bricks of religion. And what kind of laws build prisons? What kind of laws build prisons? Yes, Dr. Nils.
Laws that put debtors in jail, laws that make it a crime to steal a loaf of bread when you're starving?
Yes. Too many prisons have people in them who, if they were given liberty, if they were given freedom, could support their families, pay whatever debt they must pay back what they've taken, but why put them in jail where they can't be useful to anybody? Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. Let's look at some others. The pride of the peacock is the glory of God. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. Blake says, no. Let's recognize pride for what it is. Your pleasure in what you do well and your celebration of what you do particularly well. The nakedness of woman is the gift, is the work of God. Let's not denigrate women by claiming that they don't have virtues that ought not be celebrated. And joys impregnate, sorrows bring forth. He's dealing in paradoxes. Well, you have to understand Blake. Blake is coming from a world in which his mind says there is no separation between body and soul. Let's find a way to celebrate the human spirit. Thank you.